She thought surviving childbirth alone was the hardest part, until the man she never told finally found the truth and came for his child. Before we dive into the story, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. The storm had arrived without mercy. Wind slammed against the hospital like it meant to tear the building from its foundation, rain battering the windows in sheets so thick the world beyond the glass disappeared entirely. Thunder cracked so close it rattled ceiling tiles, and with every flash of lightning, the lights flickered, once, twice, before dimming to an anemic glow. She lay on the narrow hospital bed, with her hands clenched in the thin sheets, sweat plastering her hair to her temples, despite the cold seeping through the room. Her body was no longer hers. Pain came in waves that swallowed thought, breath, dignity, everything. She was alone. No chair pulled close to the bed. No hand wrapped around hers. No familiar voice murmuring that she was safe. Only the steady beep of a heart monitor that felt too loud and too fragile all at once. "Stay with me," the nurse said, her voice tight but steady as she adjusted the IV. "You're doing fine. Just breathe." She wanted to laugh at that. Fine implied control. This felt like being split open at the seams of existence. Another contraction tore through her, savage and unrelenting, and she cried out despite promising herself she wouldn't. Somewhere deep inside her chest lived the ache that hurt worse than her body ever could. The absence of him. He should have been here. He had promised he would always find her, always come back. But the last message she'd received from him hadn't been words. It had been chaos. A panicked phone call, screaming voices, then nothing. Now, far away from this hospital room and this storm, the man she loved was fighting his own kind of darkness. Trapped in a war he'd tried to shield her from. Buried alive by loyalties and blood debts and decisions made long before he knew love could feel like this. The lights went out completely. For one terrifying second, the room plunged into darkness so total it stole her breath. Then the generator kicked in. Weak, sputtering, unreliable. Half the machines came back online. The heart monitor stuttered, then resumed its rhythm. "Generator's failing!" someone shouted in the hallway. "We might lose power again." The nurse swore under her breath and grabbed her hand. "We're going to finish this, okay? Storm or no storm." She nodded, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes and disappearing into her hairline. This was not how she'd imagined it. Not the sterile fear. Not the shadows stretching across the walls like something alive. Not the crushing certainty that if anything went wrong, there would be no one to make it right. Another contraction hit, stronger than the last, and something inside her shifted. Final, irreversible. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," the nurse said firmly. "You're already doing it." Between flashes of lightning, memories crashed through her mind unbidden. His hands warm and steady at her waist. The way he used to look at her like the world narrowed until only she remained. The careful distance he'd begun to keep near the end, fear masked as control. Love buried beneath protection. She had wanted to tell him. God, she had wanted to tell him so badly. But every instinct she had screamed that loving him meant danger. That a child with his blood would be hunted long before they ever learned to walk. Thunder shook the building as another scream tore out of her, raw and unrestrained. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. Not to the nurse, not even to herself. To him. Minutes blurred into something timeless and brutal. The generator failed again. Emergency lights flickered on, bathing the room in red and amber shadows. The nurse barked instructions to someone over a crackling radio while helping her push through pain that felt endless. And then, a sound cut through the storm. Sharp, small, alive. The cry barely reached her ears before exhaustion swallowed her whole. She felt hands working quickly, efficiently. felt the sudden emptiness in her body that was almost more startling than the pain had been. "You have a son," the nurse said softly, awe threading her voice. "A son?" The word cracked something open inside her chest that would never close again. When they placed him against her skin, warm and trembling, she cried harder than she had the entire night. He had his father's dark hair already, damp and curling at the edges. His tiny fingers wrapped around hers with surprising strength, as if anchoring himself to the world. "I'm here," she whispered shakily. "I've got you, even if no one else does." Outside, the storm raged on, tearing through the city without care for what it destroyed. Somewhere far from that hospital room, a man was bleeding and fighting and refusing to die. Not knowing that at the exact moment his world shattered, another piece of him had been born into the chaos. That night, the world split open, and neither of them would ever be the same. Morning arrived quietly, as if the storm had exhausted itself, breaking the world apart. Pale light leaked through the narrow hospital window, washing the room in gray and gold. The generator still hummed weakly, every flicker a reminder of how fragile the night had been, and how close she'd come to losing everything. Her son slept against her chest, bundled far too large in a hospital blanket that smelled faintly of antiseptic. Each breath he took felt like a miracle she was afraid to acknowledge too loudly, as if naming it might tempt fate. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him. Not the baby in her arms, but the man who should have been there. Bloodied, caged, furious and helpless somewhere she wasn't allowed to know about. A man whose world was carved out of power and violence and rules written in blood, no matter how carefully he'd tried to shield her from it. The nurse from the night before returned quietly, her steps softer now. She checked vitals, adjusted machines, then hesitated at the foot of the bed. "You're lucky," she said gently. "Both of you." Luck, the word almost hurt. "Do you have someone coming?" the nurse asked. "Family? The father?" Her arms tightened instinctively around the baby. "No," she answered, the lie smooth because she'd rehearsed it for months. "It's just us." The nurse studied her face the way women who had seen too much sometimes did, then nodded once. No judgment, just understanding. Later, alone again, she stared down at her son and felt the weight of the decision she'd been circling for weeks finally press in, heavy and unavoidable. He had his father's eyes. That alone was dangerous. It didn't matter that she loved the man who gave them to him. Love wasn't armor. Love didn't stop bullets or vendettas or men who wanted leverage. Love wouldn't spare a child born into a legacy that others would kill to control. If she stayed, he would be found. Maybe not today. Maybe not this year. But eventually, she pressed a kiss to her son's forehead and whispered his name. Softly, reverently, like a prayer she didn't trust the world to hear. "I won't let them take you," she murmured. "I won't let anyone use you." The sound of her own voice felt steadier than her heart. By the afternoon, the hospital buzzed with recovery routines and post-storm damage reports. The chaos had passed. Systems were stabilizing. Records were being filed. That was when she made her move. The nurse returned again, this one older, tired-eyed, with hands that moved with practiced calm. They spoke briefly, quietly. Two women standing on opposite sides of something they both understood. "I need help," she said finally. "I can't stay." The nurse didn't ask why. She looked at the sleeping infant, then back at her. "Once you leave," she said carefully, "you can't be traced through us. Medical records can be sealed, but it has to be done properly." "I know," she replied. Her voice shook, but not with doubt. "I'm willing to disappear." That was the word that mattered. Disappear. No calls. No forwarding addresses. No name in the right places. No birth announcement that could be traced. No father listed. No trail, except the one she carried in her heart. The paperwork took hours. Signatures that felt like erasing parts of herself. Forms that reduced the most profound night of her life to ink and checkboxes. Every page she signed tightened the knot in her chest, but she kept going. Because stopping meant choosing fear over her child. When it was done, the nurse tucked the documents into a sealed folder and met her gaze. "Once you walk out that door," she said quietly, "this hospital will never say you were here." "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate. By evening, she was dressed in borrowed clothes. Her few belongings fit into a single bag. The storm had scrubbed the city clean, streets glistening under streetlights as if nothing terrible had ever happened. She paused at the threshold of the hospital entrance. For one fragile moment, she considered him again. Wondered if he was alive, if he would come looking, if someday he would hate her for this. Then her son stirred, a small sound against her chest, and the choice hardened into certainty. Love wasn't enough to protect him. Distance was. She stepped into the night and walked away from the life she should have had, carrying the only future that mattered, determined to raise her child in silence, unseen, believing with every part of herself that disappearing was the only way to save them both. She didn't know then what fate would eventually prove. Some storms don't end when the rain stops. They only wait. The boy grew like a secret, kept in plain sight. She chose a town where the ocean muted memories, and people learned not to ask too many questions. A place where storms came and went without spectacle, where lives were small enough to disappear into, if you tried hard enough. She rented a narrow house with peeling paint and a garden that fought her every spring. It was nothing like the world she'd left behind, and that was the point. She learned how to be quiet without being afraid. Mornings started early. She packed lunches, tied small shoes, wiped jam from his chin while he told her elaborate stories about dragons and ships and heroes who always came back. She worked 2 jobs, one that paid the bills, one that paid for a little breathing room, and smiled in all the right places. To everyone else, she was just a woman raising her son alone. But in the privacy of her thoughts, he carried a weight no one could see. There were questions he never asked. Not because he wasn't curious, but because she had learned how to answer without answering. Families come in different shapes. Some people aren't meant to stay. What matters is who shows up. And she did. Every day. She showed up when he woke crying from nightmares. She showed up with band-aids and bedtime stories, and the steady presence she had once longed for herself. She taught him kindness and caution in equal measure. How to stand up for himself without drawing attention. How to read rooms before speaking. How to trust his instincts. Instincts that felt too sharp for a child sometimes. He had his father's eyes, dark and observant, taking in details most people missed. When he concentrated, his jaw tightened in the same way. When he was angry, he went quiet instead of loud. Those moments terrified her. Each time she noticed, her breath stuttered, fear threading through love. Someone might see it. Someone who knew what to look for. The name was never spoken. Not aloud. Not in her journal. Not even in her prayers. Names had power. Names could be traced. She buried it deep inside herself and locked it away with the memory of his voice, his touch, and the promise he'd made to always find her. She told herself that promise had died the night she walked out of the hospital into the storm-washed streets. Still, the terror never fully left. Every knock on the door sent a jolt through her chest. Every unfamiliar car parked too long outside made her watchful. She memorized escape routes and backup plans the way other mothers memorized playdates. Once, when her son was 5, a man asked casually at a grocery store if she had family nearby. No, she'd replied too quickly. The man had smiled, harmless and unaware. She went home shaking anyway. But there was strength in the secret too. It had forced her to be braver than she'd ever planned, stronger, more deliberate. She had raised her son without the shadow of blood and power hanging over him. No bodyguards, no whispered threats, no guards posted at the door. Just scraped knees, laughter in the backyard, and the simple safety of being unknown. And yet, some nights, when the house was dark and the wind rattled the windows, she sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of cold tea and wondered what she'd stolen from him. A father he would never remember. A man who would have loved him fiercely. She knew that without question. She remembered how protective he'd been even before the world had taught him to be ruthless. How gentle he'd been only in moments that mattered. She wondered if he was still alive, if he'd searched, if he'd ever suspected. And every time the thought crept too close to hope, she crushed it. Hope was dangerous. Hope made you careless. Her son thrived anyway. He grew into his skin the way children do when they are loved steadily and without condition. Teachers praised him for his focus. Neighbors commented on his manners. People said he had an old soul, eyes that understood more than his years suggested. She smiled and thanked them, never letting the pride slip too deep, because pride made you visible. On his 7th birthday, a storm rolled in late that night, wind howling against the windows, rain lashing the darkened street. He woke and padded into her room, climbing into her bed without a word. "Are you scared?" she whispered, brushing his hair back. He shook his head. "Just wanted to make sure you were here." Her chest tightened. "I'm always here," she promised, pressing a kiss to his temple. She meant it. What she didn't say, and never would, was that somewhere out there was another man who had every right to make the same promise. A man whose name she still refused to speak. A secret that had kept them alive. A secret that was also a ticking clock, counting down to the day fate would refuse to be ignored any longer. The file should have been ash years ago. That was the first thought that crossed his mind when the name caught his attention. Not recognition, not shock, but irritation edged with something colder. He was standing in a glass-walled office high above the city, the kind of height that made other men feel powerful and him feel nothing at all. Rain streaked down the windows, a thin echo of a storm long past. "Why is this still here?" he asked quietly. The silence on the other end of the call stretched. Then, carefully, "It was sealed, flagged for destruction. But during the archive consolidation, something glitched. It was misfiled under emergency events instead of maternity. Emergency events. He felt it then, a subtle tightening in his chest. Familiar. Dangerous. "Read it to me," he said. The man hesitated. "Sir, this is old hospital data. 8 years back." "I know how time works," he replied evenly. "Read it." Pages turned, a throat cleared. "Admitted during severe weather conditions. Citywide blackout. Generator failure documented. Emergency delivery performed. Patient listed as..." Another pause, almost imperceptible. "Female, mid-20s. No next of kin reported. Father unknown." The office felt smaller. He moved to the window, fingers curling against the cool glass. Somewhere beneath that polished skyline lived memories he'd buried with discipline and blood. A woman he had let go because love had felt too fragile for the world he owned. "What date?" he asked. The answer landed like a measured blow. The same night he'd been pulled from a car, wrecked and flipped on the coastal highway. The same night a deal had gone wrong, and his blood had soaked into rainwater while he fought not to lose consciousness. The same storm. His jaw tightened. "Continue." Infant male, full term. Birth complications due to power instability. Assisted delivery by night staff. Records sealed at patient request. Another pause. "Sir," the attending nurse signed an affidavit of discretion. That did it. Not fear, not anger. Certainty. He didn't pace, didn't raise his voice. Men who truly controlled rooms didn't need theatrics. "Pull the storm reports," he said. "Every hospital operating during the blackout, every nurse on duty. I want names." "Yes, sir." He ended the call and stood very still. 8 years. 8 years of discipline holding the promise he'd made. To let her go. To never search. To never pull her back into the gravity of his world. He'd kept that promise even when it scraped him hollow. Even when her absence became a quiet ache he learned to carry like a scar. But this was not about breaking a promise. This was about truth finding its way through fireproof walls. A child. His child. The thought didn't explode. It didn't fracture him. It settled. Solid. Unmovable. He walked to his desk and opened a locked drawer with a key no one else had ever touched. Inside lay old maps, debts settled in blood, secrets buried deep enough that even men like him forgot their exact weight. He added one more truth to that drawer. She hadn't betrayed him. She'd survived, and she'd done it alone. That night, her night, had mirrored his. While he'd been dragged out of twisted metal and stitched together by men who owed him loyalty, she'd been fighting something far more brutal with no protection at all. He closed the drawer slowly. "I didn't know," he said to the empty room. The words weren't an apology. They were an acknowledgement. Seconds later, another call came in. "We found her," the voice said. "The nurse. She retired early. Changed her name, but not enough. Lives 2 towns over from the original hospital." He closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, but in restraint. He didn't need rage to fuel this. He needed clarity. "I don't want threats," he said. "I don't want fear." "Sir, I want answers." The city moved beneath him, unaware that something ancient had shifted direction. He had built empires, crushed men who mistook mercy for weakness, reshaped his world with ruthless intention. But this was different. This was legacy. Somewhere out there, a boy existed who shared his blood, his bones, perhaps even his quiet fury at the unfairness of the world. And the woman he'd loved had carried that weight alone because she believed disappearing was the only way to keep him safe. He straightened his cuffs, calm returning like a blade sliding back into its sheath. He would not ask why. He would not demand explanations. He would follow the trail the storm had left behind, and when he found them, he would make sure no one ever forced her to disappear again. He didn't sit with the truth long enough for it to fester. That was the thing about him. He had never been a man who wallowed. Regret was a luxury for people who could afford stillness. He moved because movement was how you survived. The moment certainty settled in his bones, he turned it into action. Dates first, always dates. He spread the timeline across the table in his private study, the kind of room built to withstand storms, both physical and political. Screens lit softly in the dimness, throwing blue light over his hands as they worked with controlled precision. The blackout, the coastal storm, the emergency hospital intake logs. His own disappearance from public record the same night, replaced with rumors of death and silence enforced by men who knew better than to speak. 2 lives diverging in parallel chaos. He didn't ask why she hadn't told him. That question belonged to a weaker version of himself, one that would have demanded explanations to soothe wounded pride. Pride had nothing to do with this. He already knew the answer. She had done what he had taught her to do. Protect what matters. Eliminate exposure. Choose survival over sentiment. If anything, it cut deeper than betrayal ever could. He cross-referenced hospital capacity charts with storm surge maps, tracing where ambulances would have been rerouted when roads flooded. Generator failure logs narrowed the list further. Only 3 hospitals had been operating at partial capacity that night. 1 file, 1 misstep, 1 child born while the city drowned. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Not to grieve, but to recalibrate. Somewhere in that pause lived the ghost of the promise he'd made her years ago. "I won't come looking." He had kept it, but the promise had never included ignorance. When the truth came to him, uninvited and unavoidable, everything shifted. This was no longer about restraint. This was about responsibility. Locations came next. The nurse's new name, her relocation permits. A quiet life funded by a modest severance and a pension fast-tracked through channels that rarely moved without pressure. She hadn't done this alone. Not entirely. Someone had helped. Someone who believed, as she had, that secrecy was mercy. He approved the surveillance but forbade confrontation. Cameras, footage, patterns. He wanted to know the shape of her life now before he stepped into it. And then there was the child. He didn't search databases for the boy. Didn't run facial recognition or bloodline software. Those tools were blunt instruments. They made messes and left traces. Instead, he studied school district boundaries near the nurse's address, pediatric clinics, library card registries, soccer schedules, the soft infrastructure of ordinary lives that never noticed predators until it was too late. He smiled once at that. Predators always underestimated the quiet. A call came in from his security chief. "We can have eyes on the area within 48 hours. "Discreet," he said. "No disruptions, no pressure." "And if she runs?" "She won't," he replied calmly. "She's already run once. She chose stability." He rose and poured himself a drink he wouldn't touch. In his mind, he saw her as she had been that last night. The way her mouth had trembled when she told him goodbye. The way she'd walked away without looking back, because looking back would have shattered her resolve. He respected that kind of strength. He would not punish it. Still, something low and dangerous coiled in his chest when he imagined her doing this alone. Bleeding. Afraid. Making life-altering decisions under flickering lights while the storm tried to tear the world apart. While he had been fighting to stay alive. He set the glass down untouched. "You didn't owe me your body," he murmured to the empty room. "But you should never have had to carry that alone." When he moved again, it was with purpose sharpened by restraint. Private transport arrangements were made, not with urgency but with inevitability. No false names, no rushed timelines. He wasn't chasing. He was reclaiming. Before he left, he sent one final instruction. "Secure everything connected to that night," he said. "Storm reports, hospital oversight boards, anyone who could exploit this." "Yes, sir. And if enemies are already circling?" There was a pause. "They will be," the voice said. His expression didn't change. "Good," he replied. "Let them know now. The past just stood up." He didn't know exactly what he would say when he saw her again. He didn't rehearse accusations or apologies. Some truths were too large for scripts. But one thing was unmovable. He wasn't going to ask why she disappeared. He was going to find his child. And this time, the storm wouldn't take anything from him. The nurse lived in a house that had learned how to be invisible. Not abandoned. Not hidden. Just unremarkable. Beige siding. A narrow porch with a wind chime that sang softly when the breeze turned just right. A place chosen by someone who understood that survival often depended on how little attention you invited. He watched it for an hour before approaching. From the inside of a car, no one would ever trace back to him. She came and went on a predictable schedule. Morning walks, a weekly grocery trip, afternoon visits from a neighbor with a small dog and loud opinions. No signs of fear, but something else instead. Watchfulness. A woman who had learned long ago that kindness sometimes came with consequences. When he finally knocked, she opened the door as if she had expected him. Not him specifically. "But this moment." "You took your time," she said quietly. That startled him more than any weapon could have. "You know who I am," he replied, his voice calm, unthreatening by design. She nodded once. "I've known for years. Men like you don't lose things." "You wait." She stepped aside without being asked. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and paper. Old books, photographs turned face down on shelves. No family portraits on the walls. A life pared down to essentials. They sat at a small kitchen table. She poured tea with hands that trembled only slightly. "I didn't do it for money," she said before he could speak. "And I didn't do it for fear." "Then why?" he asked gently. "For love," she replied. The word hung in the air between them, fragile and unyielding. She folded her hands together. "That night, the generator failed twice. We lost fetal monitors. The doors were locked to keep floodwater out, but the power surge nearly shut everything down. She was alone, terrified. I've seen many births. I've never seen someone fight that hard while holding back that much fear." He said nothing. "She kept asking if someone had called you," the nurse continued. "Didn't say your name. Just him. Over and over, even when the pain was breaking her. When I told her no one could reach anyone outside the building, she stopped asking. Something in his chest tightened." "She said it was supposed to be quiet," the nurse whispered. "That if anyone with power noticed the birth, the child would never be free. I didn't understand then. Not fully. But I could see she wasn't running from you." "She was running from the world I belonged to," he said softly. The nurse nodded. "Exactly." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin envelope, yellowed at the edges. Inside were copies. Notes. A single handwritten log. She slid it across the table. "She didn't beg me," the nurse said. "She didn't cry. She asked me what I would do if it were my child, if someone dangerous loved them too much." He didn't open the envelope yet. "What did you tell her?" he asked. "That love isn't always gentle," the nurse said, "but that running forever steals something too." Her voice broke then, finally. "She left with nothing. No name, no trace. Just the baby, and a certainty that she'd rather you hate her forever than come looking and get him killed." Silence settled heavy and thick. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "She thought I wouldn't change," he said. Not bitterly, just truthfully. "She thought you would," the nurse corrected. "That's why she left. She thought becoming a father would turn the world into a weapon." That landed. He finally opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of the sealed birth record. No father listed. A timestamp he knew as well as his own scars. And tucked between the pages, a small photograph taken hastily. A newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket. Tiny fists curled tight. Dark eyes barely open. His throat closed. "She wanted you to know," the nurse said quickly. "Someday, when it was safe. I think she believed the world would soften, or that you would step away from it." He closed the envelope with care it hadn't known in years. "She underestimated both of us," he said. The nurse studied him for a long moment. "Are you going to punish her for what I did?" "No," he replied immediately. "Then what will you do?" He stood slowly, adjusting his coat, composure returning like armor sliding into place. "I'm going to finish what she started," he said, "and make sure love doesn't require disappearance anymore." At the door, he paused. "You did the right thing," he told the nurse. "But secrets don't protect forever. They only buy time." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Then I hope she forgives me." "So do I," he said, and meant more than she could ever know. As he stepped back into the quiet street, one truth rang clearer than any gunshot ever had. That night hadn't just been desperate. It had been brave, and it had changed everything. The town announced itself with a single stoplight and a welcome sign that hadn't been repainted in years. He noticed details others would miss. The way the road narrowed as if discouraging strangers. The grocery with handwritten hours taped to the door. The elementary school set back behind a chain-link fence, painted cheerful colors that fooled no one. This was where you came to be forgotten. He parked on a quiet street and stepped out into air that smelled faintly of salt and wet earth, remnants of storms that came and went without headlines. The place felt held together by habits rather than ambition. People here knew each other's routines. Absence would be noticed. Newness would not be welcomed. Good. He moved through the town without hurry, dressed plainly for once. The power he carried folded neatly away where only men like him could feel its weight. He didn't need fear here. Fear would have reached her long before he did. He started with the school. Not inside. Never inside. He watched from across the street as parents gathered in loose clusters, voices low, laughter casual. Children poured out in bursts of noise and movement, shoes untied, backpacks half-zipped, joy unguarded. Then he saw him. The boy stood apart, not alone, just observant. Dark hair curling at the nape of his neck, too serious for his age. He crouched to retie a friend's shoe with deliberate care that made something inside the man go still. The boy looked up, and the world narrowed. It wasn't just the eyes, though those were unmistakable. Dark, focused, old beyond their years. It was the way the child held himself. Balanced, ready, not defensive, not reckless. The posture he'd learned in alleyways and boardrooms alike. A breath left his lungs before he remembered to take another. Blood spoke in ways science could never fully explain. The boy's mother appeared then, hurrying across the street, hair pulled back, a bag slung over one shoulder. Her smile came quick and bright when she saw the child, relief flaring like sunlight. She knelt, said something he couldn't hear, brushed hair from the boy's eyes with a tenderness that hurt to witness. The child leaned into her without hesitation. That was the part that nearly undid him, because it meant she had done well, because it meant he had been loved completely, fiercely, without condition, and because it meant he was already too late to be the beginning of that story. He stayed where he was until they left, until the street emptied and the town swallowed itself back into routine. Then he moved. He didn't follow her home. Not yet. This wasn't a pursuit. This was acknowledgement. He walked the main street, took in the rhythms. The diner where the same waitress refilled the same mugs. The small hardware store that still carried nails by the pound. The park with a rusted swing set where laughter echoed like a promise. He imagined the boy there. Scraped knees. Long summer days. A childhood without guards or whispered warnings. This was the life she had chosen. This was the life she had protected. That night, he sat in his rental car and let the truth settle fully into him, not as a wound, but as a recalibration. Home wasn't a place, it was a gravity, and this town, too small to hide big secrets, had been strong enough to hold the most important one of his life. He didn't rehearse the meeting, didn't plan words that would try to erase time. There was no sentence that could bridge 8 years of absence, no apology that could smooth the past into something gentle. He understood that. He also understood something else now. He wasn't here to take. He was here to stand. When he finally drove away, it was with a new restraint settled in his bones. Not the restraint of denial, but of respect. He would give her the choice. And when he returned, as he would do so openly. The storm had led him home at last, and this time he wasn't going anywhere. Morning came soft and deceptively ordinary. Sunlight spilled across the small park as if nothing monumental was about to happen. Birds argued in the trees. A jogger passed with earbuds in. Life continued, blissfully unaware that destiny had finally decided to stop circling and step forward. He stood at the edge of the park, coffee cooling untouched in his hand, watching. The boy was there again, this time closer. He was kicking a soccer ball back and forth with another child, movements fluid, balanced, not flashy, efficient. When the other boy stumbled, he stopped immediately, reached out, made sure he was okay before resuming play. The gesture hit harder than recognition ever could. Compassion paired with vigilance. That combination didn't come from nowhere. Then it happened. The ball rolled wide, veering toward the path where he stood. The boy chased it, moving fast, laughing, until his foot caught on the uneven edge of the pavement. Time slowed. The man stepped forward without thinking. Strong hands caught small shoulders before the child could hit the ground. The impact was light, barely anything, but when the boy looked up, everything stopped. Those eyes, not just dark, knowing. Sharp in a way children shouldn't have to be yet. The same eyes that had stared men down across negotiation tables. The same eyes that calculated exits in crowded rooms. Blood spoke again, louder this time. "Careful," he said instinctively, voice low and steady. The boy blinked up at him, unafraid. Curious. Assessing in that unchildlike way that made something in the man's chest twist hard. "I was watching the ball," the boy said seriously. "Not the ground." A corner of the man's mouth twitched before he could stop it. "The ground is always the part that surprises you." The boy considered that, nodding as if it were wisdom worth filing away. "What's your name?" the boy asked. The question landed softly and utterly without defense. He hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Then, honestly, "I'm a friend." The boy accepted that with a shrug, scooping up the ball. "I'm Eli." The name struck deep and clean. Before he could respond, a voice cut through the air, tight, breathless, familiar, in a way that turned his spine to steel. "Eli." She was running toward them, her face drained of color as she took in the scene, her son safe and upright, and the man standing in front of him. Him. The world narrowed again, but this time it wasn't wonder that filled the space. It was collision. She stopped short, eyes locked on his like prey, realizing too late that the hunter had always been patient. For one suspended heartbeat, none of them moved. Then the boy turned, smiling. "Mom, I almost fell, but he caught me." Her gaze never left his. He saw fear there, yes, but also resignation. And beneath that, something like grief wrapped so tightly in control, it had taken 8 years to breathe again. "Eli," she said carefully, forcing calm into her voice. "Go play. I'll be right here." The boy glanced between them, curious, sensing tension he couldn't name yet. He obeyed, running back toward the field, though he looked over his shoulder twice. As soon as he was out of earshot, she spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. "I know," he replied gently. She swallowed. "Did you—" She stopped, restarted. "How?" "A file," he said simply. "A storm. A nurse who loved you enough to lie." Her eyes closed for a moment. Just one. When they opened again, something had shifted. The secret had finally been seen. Carried. Acknowledged. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. He looked past her just briefly, to where their son laughed again, alive and bright and untouched by the darkness that owned so much of the man's world. "I didn't come to take him," he said quietly. "Or you." She searched his face, desperate for any sign of deceit. "What did you come for?" she asked. His answer was steady, certain. "Because denial ended the moment I looked into his eyes," he said. "And destiny doesn't knock twice." A shout rang out as Eli scored a goal, joy echoing across the park. The sound settled something deep in the man's chest. Blood had been proven. Fate had stepped forward. And none of them would be able to pretend otherwise again. That night fear didn't creep in. It slammed. She didn't sleep. She lay rigid in bed listening to the rhythm of her son's breathing down the hall, every small sound amplified until it felt like danger knocking from inside the walls. The house she had trusted for years suddenly felt thin, fragile, like a stage set that could be torn down with one determined hand. He knew. The truth settled into her bones with a sickening finality. Not suspected, Not guessed. Known. She replayed the moment in the park over and over until it blurred. The way his body had moved before thought. The way his eyes had locked on Eli's like he'd been struck by something undeniable and sacred. She had seen recognition bloom there, fierce and immediate, and she had known in that instant that the lie she had lived inside for 8 years had finally failed her. She rose before dawn. The sky was barely lightening when she moved through the house with ruthless efficiency, the kind born of survival instinct and old terror. She packed silently, choosing only what mattered. Clothes for her son, his favorite book, the small carved animal he slept with when storms rattled the windows. No photographs. Those could be traced. She unplugged her phone and slid it into the bottom of the bag without turning it on. No calls. No pings. No last looks at the life she had built so carefully. Her hands shook anyway. It was worse this time. Before, she had been running from a shadow, a possibility, a future she feared but could still imagine might never arrive. Now she was running from truth. From a man who had looked at her child with something dangerously close to reverence. From a world that, once it knew Eli existed, would never stop seeing him as leverage, legacy, bloodline. She crouched in her son's doorway and watched him sleep, throat tightening. 8 years ago, she had walked into a storm carrying only fear and determination. At this time, she would be tearing him out of a life he loved. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though he couldn't hear. "I'm trying to save you." The sound of tires on gravel froze her mid-breath. Not fast, not aggressive, deliberate. She moved to the window, heart slamming against her ribs. A familiar car sat at the curb. Not black, not armored, not screaming threat. Still unmistakably his. Her chest hollowed out with a strange mix of dread and rage. He hadn't stormed in, hadn't followed her from the park, hadn't sent men. He had waited, as if giving her space to decide. That, somehow, frightened her more than force ever could. She backed away, urgency overtaking precision. She shook her son awake gently, whispering reassurances even as panic threaded her voice. "We're going on a trip," she told him. "Just a little one." Eli rubbed his eyes. "Is something wrong?" "No," she lied, hating herself for it. "Just time." A knock sounded. Once. Firm. Controlled. The sound echoed through the house like a verdict. She stood between the door and her son instinctively, hands curling into fists that would be useless against the world he came from, and yet she braced anyway. When she opened the door, he wasn't angry. That almost broke her. He stood alone, hands visible, coat open, eyes steady. Not a threat. Not a demand. Just presence. "You're leaving," he said calmly. She didn't deny it. "You can't stay," she said, voice sharp with desperation. "You've seen him. That's enough." "For you," he replied evenly. "Not for him." Her breath hitched. "You don't get to decide that." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here, to stop you from deciding out of fear." She shook her head, backing away. "You don't understand. If anyone else finds out, if your enemies—" "They will," he interrupted quietly. "Running won't stop that now. It will only make you obvious." The truth of it sliced clean. She swallowed hard. "Then why did you come?" "Because this time," he said, voice low but unyielding, "you don't have to disappear to protect him." She laughed, brittle and near tears. "You live in a world where protection is bought in blood." "And I know that world better than anyone," he said, "which is why I know when distance stops being safety." Her son appeared behind her, small hand clutching her shirt. "Mom," Eli whispered. "Who is he?" Her heart fractured. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had fled, the man fate had dragged back into her life with merciless precision. The man who now waited, not reaching, not commanding, for a choice. She wrapped an arm around her child and whispered the truth she had tried to outrun for years. He's someone important. Eli looked at him, then back at her. He looks like me. Silence fell heavy and unavoidable. She realized then that running again wouldn't erase what had already been seen. Fear had driven her once, but fear, she now understood, was no longer enough to outrun destiny. He waited until her breathing slowed, until the instinct to flee loosened its grip just enough for words to land without shattering her completely. They sat at opposite ends of the small kitchen table, dawn light creeping in through the thin curtains. Her son was in his room again, building towers out of old blocks, the quiet thud of wood against wood grounding her in the present. He did not look around the house, did not judge its smallness or its wear. He looked only at her. You think I left because I chose distance, he said finally. His voice was quiet, controlled, but threaded with something unmistakably raw. That I walked away because it was easier. She clenched her hands in her lap. You disappeared. Yes, he agreed, because I was made to. Her eyes lifted, sharp and disbelieving. The night you vanished, he continued, I was supposed to die. The words settled heavily between them. I survived, he said, but not freely. Everything that followed was containment, damage control, a world closing in on itself so it wouldn't collapse. She felt cold bloom in her chest. I kept my word, he said, voice steady. I didn't look for you, even when it hurt, even when the silence nearly hollowed me out. You could have tried, she said bitterly. He leaned forward then, forearms braced on the table. And brought fire with me? You think I didn't consider that? Every contact, every name, every possible way back to you? Her mouth opened, but no words came. I stayed away, because distance was the only thing I could give you that wouldn't get you killed, he said. That wasn't abandonment. That was restraint. Her eyes burned. And the years I spent alone? She demanded. The nights I thought you'd forgotten me? He swallowed hard, just once. I remembered you every day, he said. I just loved you enough not to reach. Silence stretched, fragile and aching. You don't understand what it was like, she whispered. Being pregnant and terrified and certain the only way to keep him alive was to make sure you never knew he existed. His gaze softened, not with pity, but with reverence. I do understand, he said, because you did what I would have done. She shook her head. Then why are you here now? Because protection has a half-life, he replied. The world we tried to outrun caught up, and when it did, I realized something. He stood slowly, crossing the space between them without touching her. He stopped close enough for her to feel the warmth of him, but far enough that she didn't feel cornered. I didn't come to take your life apart, he said quietly. I came because my absence stopped being a shield. Her pulse hammered. I would never take him from you, he continued. I would never take you anywhere you didn't choose. She searched his face for possession, for entitlement. Found none. I didn't walk away from you because I stopped caring, he said. I walked away because the world I live in punishes attachment. And now? She asked. Now the world already knows, he said, and I refuse to pretend love is something I should apologize for. Tears slid down her cheeks before she realized they'd fallen. You don't know him, she whispered. You don't know how gentle he is, how much he loves this place, how much disruption will hurt him. He nodded. And I will follow your lead on that. Always. She laughed then, a broken sound. Always, she repeated. You don't even promise that. I don't promise what I can't earn, he said, but I will prove it. She felt the shift then. Not safety, not surrender. choice. You were wrong about one thing, he added softly. What? I didn't walk away from you, he said. I stood still so you could move. The truth of it cracked something open inside her that fear had sealed shut. For the first time in years, she wasn't running. She was standing. The first sign wasn't a gun. It wasn't a threat. It was silence, where there had once been rhythm. The bakery opened late. The soccer coach canceled practice without explanation. The neighbor with the loud dog stopped waving from across the street. Small disruptions that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't lived her life with one eye always scanning for danger. She felt it in her bones before she could explain it. They know, she said quietly. He didn't argue. He didn't dismiss it as paranoia or fear clinging too tightly to old ghosts. He stood at the window, phone pressed to his ear, listening to a report coming through encrypted static. Yes, he said calmly. Confirm the source. No escalation, unless I say so. He ended the call and turned to her. His face was carved from stillness now. Something colder than control. Something older than patience. You were right, he said. Legacy draws attention faster than crime ever does. Her stomach twisted. How bad? They haven't named him, he replied. Not yet, but whispers move faster than bullets. Someone connected the dates, the blackout, the hospital. She closed her eyes. The storm had finally circled back. This is my fault, she whispered. He crossed the room immediately. Not quickly, not urgently, with intention. He stopped in front of her, steady hands bracing her shoulders, not to trap her, but to ground her. No, he said with absolute certainty. This is the cost of bloodlines, not of love. As if summoned by the words, a car rolled past the house too slowly. Dark windows, plates she didn't recognize. Her heart began to race. Her son's laughter drifted from down the hall, soft and oblivious. That was when fear became fury, because the past she had fled wasn't just knocking anymore. It was circling. Who? She asked. He hesitated just long enough to tell the truth mattered. Men who hated my father, he said. Men who believe inheritance is weakness. And men who would use a child to force my hand. Her breath hitched. They won't come through the front door, he continued. They'll use pressure, disruption, make you feel unstable, unsafe. She laughed hollowly. They're late. He didn't smile. By nightfall, the escalation began. A social worker showed up with vague concerns and a smile too tight to be friendly. A letter arrived questioning her employment records. A report, false but detailed, was filed questioning her fitness as a mother. Each one cut precisely, professionally. This wasn't violence yet. It was preparation. They're trying to corner us, she said, hands shaking as she read the notice. No, he corrected. They're testing me. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her son's bed long after he drifted off, watching his small chest rise and fall. I tried so hard to keep you invisible, she whispered. He appeared in the doorway without sound. You didn't fail, he said. You delayed. And that delay gave him 8 years of peace. She looked at him, eyes burning. And now? Now they've made the mistake of reminding me why I built what I did, he replied. There was a knock just past midnight. Not loud, not threatening, controlled. He was already moving before she could speak, body instinctively placing itself between her and the door. He checked the security feed, jaw tightening. Stay here, he said. With him. I'm not hiding, she said fiercely. He met her gaze. You're protecting. The knock came again. When he opened the door, the man on the other side smiled in a way that never reached his eyes. Congratulations, the stranger said smoothly. On your heir. The word hung like a curse. He didn't react. You've got 5 seconds, he said calmly, to leave my family's proximity forever. The smile faltered just enough. Or? The man challenged. Or, he replied quietly, you will remind every organization that ever underestimated legacy why blood carries consequences. The man left, slowly, deliberately. When the door closed, she realized something terrifying and clarifying all at once. She was no longer running from a past she'd escaped. She was standing inside a future others wanted to claim. And this time, the man beside her wasn't asking her to disappear. He was preparing for war. Not for power, but for family. The storm came back, the way it always did, without apology, without warning. But this time, it didn't take them by surprise. Rain hammered against reinforced glass as night pressed in around the house that had stopped pretending it was hidden. Security lights cut through the darkness. Quiet men moved at the edges of the property, not looming, not loud, present in the way only professionals were. Inside, her son slept peacefully. That was the miracle. She stood at the window, arms wrapped around herself, watching rain blur the world beyond. For the first time since the truth had surfaced, her chest didn't feel tight with panic. Fear was still there, but it no longer owned her. He came up behind her without touching her at first. Gave her space. Always that. They won't try again tonight, he said calmly. They tested the perimeter. Found nothing they could crack without consequences. She nodded. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, he said. I end it. She turned to face him then. Really face him. You don't mean violence, she said. No, he replied. I mean exposure, seizures, alliances reminded where their loyalties truly lie. I didn't build power to terrorize. I built it to finish wars before they start. She searched his face, looking for the man she had once loved, the one she had left behind in a storm. He was still there, but so was something else now. A father. What happens after? She asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. He placed it gently on the table between them. She unfolded it with shaking hands. Legal recognition, no theatrics, no public announcement. Just ink and truth. Her breath caught. You don't have to sign anything tonight, he said softly, or ever. I will not force myself into his life, or yours. And if I don't? She asked. Then I stay close enough to protect, he said, and far enough to respect your choice. She closed the document slowly. 8 years ago, she had chosen disappearance because it was the only protection she could imagine. Because love had felt like a liability fate would exploit. Now love stood in front of her without demand. No, she said quietly. If we do this, we don't do it halfway. He stilled. Are you sure? She didn't answer him. She walked down the hall instead, pushed open her son's door, and sat beside his bed. He stirred, eyes opening slowly, instinctively reaching for her hand. Mom? I'm here, she whispered. Then, after a breath she'd waited years to take, she said, There's someone who wants to talk to you. If you want. Her son blinked sleepily. Is it the man from the park? Yes, she said. Okay, he replied simply as if accepting the weather. He's not scary. She laughed softly through tears. When the man stepped into the doorway, something ancient and fragile settled into place. He didn't kneel, didn't overwhelm. He sat on the edge of the bed, careful, reverent. Hi, he said. The boy studied him with quiet seriousness. You look like me. A ghost of a smile crossed the man's face, raw, unguarded. So I've been told. What's your name? The boy asked. He glanced at her once. She nodded. My name, he said gently, is yours too, if you want it to be. The boy considered that, then yawned. Okay, can you come to my game tomorrow? The question wasn't a demand, it was an invitation. Yes, he said immediately. "I'll be there." The boy smiled and fell back asleep as if nothing monumental had just happened. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, breath shaking. "You don't even know what that means to me," she whispered. "I do," he said, "because I missed 8 years of it." Outside, the rain began to ease. By morning, the war was over before it ever reached their door. Accounts frozen, partners scattered, threats dissolved in the face of preparation and resolve. But that wasn't the victory. The victory came later, quietly. A man standing at the sidelines of a soccer field. A woman beside him, not behind. A child who laughed without fear of being seen. He had claimed his child, not with force, but with presence. He had claimed his woman, not as possession, but as partner. And together they claimed a future that fate had tried and failed to erase. Some bonds are forged in storms, and some families don't just survive them. They rise, unbroken, on the other side.